A struggling teacher was fired for protecting a poor child. But her new principal changed everything. This is the third time he has come to school with holes in his shoes. An empty stomach. And no one to walk him through the doors. And you are telling me he is a disruption to the class? Sarah's voice was quiet but firm, slicing through the stale air of the principal's office, which smelled of stale coffee and bureaucracy. Principal Blake didn't flinch, his face a mask of cold indifference. I said, he repeated slowly, as if speaking to a child. Children like him do not belong in this environment. Outside, the wind scraped against the windows, rustling the bare trees of their small, worn-down Kentucky town. At Jefferson Elementary, discipline was king. Warmth came second, if at all. Sarah, 26, stood straight, her blonde hair falling softly past her shoulders, her patched sweater pulled tight around her. Her boots were scuffed, her palms clenched at her sides. She had grown up with less than most and carried that history not as shame, but as proof she had survived. Every morning, she placed a single apple in her desk drawer. It was a silent offering. Not for herself, but for whichever child needed it most. No one ever asked for it. Sometimes it disappeared. Sometimes it stayed. Jack was often the one who took it. A fourth grader. Thin. Quiet. And perpetually overlooked. His pants were always a size too big or too small, held together with a length of twine. He rarely spoke, but he left behind tiny, anonymous thank you gifts. A pencil stub, sharpened with meticulous care, tucked in her drawer. Once, he left a bruised apple. She held it in her hand like it was made of gold. Later that day, Blake summoned her to his office. You've been reported, he said, his tone devoid of emotion. Favoritism. Feeding a student. Allowing Jack to stay after hours. He is hungry, Sarah said, her voice steady. Blake stood, looming over his desk. This is not a charity, Miss Ellis. It's a school. It should be both, she replied, the words escaping before she could stop them. He handed her a formal reprimand. Next time, it will be termination. That night, by the soft glow of a candle, Sarah wrote a letter to the district. She asked them to review the school's treatment of underprivileged students. She signed it, folded it, and sealed it with a quiet, fragile hope. The next morning, she arrived early and placed the envelope on Blake's desk. What is this? He asked, his voice laced with suspicion. A letter to the district. Blake opened it, his eyes scanning the page in silence. Then, without a word, he tore it in half. Then again. And again. Letting the pieces flutter onto his desk like dead leaves. You do not speak for this institution, he said, his voice a low growl. You do not challenge leadership. Sarah stood frozen. The air knocked from her lungs. Then, she turned and left. In the hallway, whispers followed her like shadows. Teachers avoided her eyes. She walked to her classroom, opened her drawer, and found it empty. No pencil stub. No apple. Just silence. The termination letter came printed in bold black ink on Jefferson Elementary's official letterhead. It used the word incompatible 3 times. But the phrase that cut deepest was effective immediately. Sarah read the letter alone in her classroom as the sky outside darkened with rain. Her hands shook slightly as she folded the paper and slipped it into her worn leather bag. The one she had carried since college. No one saw her leave the building. No goodbyes. No final glances. Just the sound of her boots echoing in the hallway as she stepped into the cold Kentucky rain. She walked home through puddles. Past flickering streetlights and familiar landmarks, the diner where she worked weekends. The library where she read to children. The gas station where Jack's mother sometimes stood outside in silence, waiting for a ride that never seemed to come. By the time she reached the trailer she shared with her grandmother, she was soaked through. Ruth opened the door. Worry already etched in the lines of her eyes. They did it. Didn't they? Sarah nodded. Too tired to speak. Inside, she sat at the small kitchen table, her bag still pressed against her. Ruth made her a cup of tea and held her hand. You're young, sweetheart. You can still choose a different path. One that doesn't break your heart. Sarah stared at the steam rising from her mug. Her voice was barely audible. I was born to teach. The next morning, she began packing her books into boxes. She called the diner and asked for more hours. She considered leaving town Lexington. Maybe. Or farther anywhere she would not have to explain why she had failed. But fate had other plans. That afternoon, the local paper ran a headline, Teacher let go after feeding hungry student. The photo showed Sarah kneeling beside Jack, who was half hidden behind her skirt. The article called it a disputed case, outlining how she had broken school rules in the name of compassion. Some readers glanced and turned the page. Others whispered about it in grocery store aisles. But one man, 60 miles away, folded the paper carefully and read it again. Charles Cole, the headmaster of a small independent school called New Hope Academy, believed in second chances and the kind of teachers who taught with their hearts. The story about Sarah didn't shock him. It moved him. That same evening, he wrote her an email. Dear Miss Ellis, I read about you in the Herald today. I do not know all the details. Nor do I need to. What I do know is that any teacher who gives a child an apple from her own lunch is the kind of teacher I want at New Hope Academy. If you are willing, I would like to meet. Sarah found the message the next morning, blinking at the screen. At first, she thought it was a mistake. But the email address was real. The school had a website. And the words felt sincere. She replied with cautious hope. Later that week, they met in a quiet cafe on the edge of the city. Charles stood when she arrived, wearing a simple navy sweater. His handshake was warm, his eyes steady. They talked for hours about education, children, and the things standardized tests could never measure. He never asked about the incident. He only asked what she would do if she had another chance. And in that moment, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe she still did. New Hope Academy was nothing like Jefferson Elementary. There were no polished marble floors or metal detectors. No automated bell system. No harsh white lights flickering above tents. Orderly hallways. Instead, the school sat nestled between 2 tall oak trees. Its brick exterior weathered but warm. Its windows open to let in the fresh air. Even in early spring. The building was smaller than Sarah expected. Almost like a large house repurposed into something softer. Something that invited you to exhale. Children's laughter floated through the air as she stepped inside for the first time. The front office smelled faintly of cinnamon and pencil shavings. On one wall hung a mural. Painted. It seemed. By the students themselves. Of hands reaching toward a sun made of book pages. Beneath it. A phrase had been painted in sweeping gold letters, "We learn by heart." Charles met her in the hallway. Holding a cup of coffee with a clipboard tucked beneath his arm. He smiled. Not the practiced, tight-lipped kind she had seen so often in school administrators. But a genuine smile that reached the corners of his eyes. "Welcome to New Hope, Miss Ellis," he said. "Let me show you around." As they walked, Sarah noticed the students. They did not rush or shuffle anxiously. They waved to Charles, who greeted each one by name. In the classrooms, beanbags and mismatched chairs replaced stark rows of desks. There were plants on the windowsills, vibrant art on the walls, and shelves of worn paperbacks with sticky notes poking from their spines. "This is a school?" Sarah asked softly, half to herself. Charles glanced at her and grinned. "We like to think so. A school without walls, not literally, but in spirit. We don't search for perfect teachers here, Miss Ellis. Just those brave enough to love." They stopped at the door of what would be her classroom. Sarah stepped inside, took a breath, and let her eyes sweep the room. The whiteboard was scuffed but clean. A colorful rug sat in the center of the room, surrounded by chairs that did not match. A tall window opened to the schoolyard, where a garden patch peeked from behind a fence. She set her bag down on the desk and exhaled. For the first time in weeks, she felt the tightness in her chest loosen. Her first day began quietly. 12 students, all between the ages of 9 and 11, filed in with cautious curiosity. They were different from the students at Jefferson. There was a boy who tapped the edge of his chair every 3 seconds. A girl who wore a winter hat indoors and refused to take it off. A tall boy with downcast eyes and no backpack. But they watched her. They listened. Sarah started the day with a story. Reading from an old book with cracked pages and a faded cover. Her voice was soft at first, uncertain. But as the children leaned in, their eyes widening, she grew steadier. They asked questions. They laughed at the funny parts. One even clapped at the end. She wrote their names on the board, one by one, asking each child to tell her something they loved. One said, "Birds." Another said, "Quiet." One whispered, "The sound of my brother coming home." Charles watched from the door for a moment. Unnoticed. He saw the way Sarah tilted her head as she listened. How she crouched beside a student rather than standing above them. How she handed out pencils like they were golden keys to a different world. During lunch, he passed by her room again. She was on the floor, helping a girl tie her shoelaces. The girl looked up at her, eyes wide and uncertain. Sarah smiled gently and said something he could not hear. The girl smiled back. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip and the students packed their bags, Sarah sat at her desk, looking out the window. Her eyes were tired but bright. In her drawer was an apple not from her, but from a student. It was not bruised, not polished. Just an apple. Left quietly. Charles knocked on the open door. "How was day one?" he asked. Sarah turned. And for the first time since leaving Jefferson, she smiled fully. It felt like breathing again. She said. He nodded, holding her gaze a moment longer than necessary. "Good. You belong here." She watched him leave. His steps quiet. His shoulders relaxed. Alone in the classroom, she looked around at the messy bulletin board, the scuffed rug, the half-read books scattered across desks. It was not perfect, but it was alive. And for the first time in a long while, so was she. It was a rainy Thursday when Jack appeared again. Sarah was in the middle of her morning routine, laying out vocabulary cards on the classroom rug, when the receptionist tapped gently on her door. "Miss Ellis. There's someone at the gate asking for you," she said hesitantly. "A parent?" Sarah blinked. The woman shook her head. "No. A boy. He says he knows you. He won't come inside." Her heart suddenly pounding. Sarah hurried through the front office and stepped outside into the misty morning air. The school gate, just beyond the picket fence, creaked slightly in the wind. And there, standing under a crooked umbrella that looked too large for his narrow shoulders, was Jack. He had grown taller, but he still had the same solemn eyes, the same too-thin frame, the same silence clinging to him like a second skin. His coat was damp and frayed at the cuffs. His shoes were different now, but still worn, squishing softly in the puddles beneath him. "Jack," Sarah whispered, stepping forward. She dropped to her knees. Her own umbrella forgotten. Raindrops falling into her golden hair. Jack stared at her, unmoving. For a second, it seemed he might turn and run. Then, in a fragile voice, he asked, "Is this a safe school?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She nodded, tears already threatening to spill. "Yes, baby," she managed to say. "It is." She reached out slowly, cautiously, until Jack stepped into her arms. He didn't hug tightly. He just rested his head against her shoulder as if testing the moment. She felt him trembling. She gently rubbed his back, whispering, "Have you eaten today?" He nodded against her. But she felt the lie in the slight hesitation. From a short distance, Charles stood beneath the covered walkway, watching the scene unfold. He said nothing, just pressed one hand to his chest as if to still something in himself. Then, quietly, he turned and walked back inside. In the school cafeteria, Sarah sat Jack down at a small, round table. She brought him a peanut butter sandwich, a carton of milk, and an apple. He ate in small, slow bites, barely making a sound. "I didn't know where you went," she said softly. "After I left." Jack shrugged. "We moved a lot. My mom. She was sick for a while. Then she got better. Then worse again. We're in a shelter now." Sarah swallowed hard. "Do you live close?" "2 bus rides." he said. But I remembered the name of this school. I saw it once in a newspaper with your name. Her heart twisted. You came looking for me? Jack glanced up from his sandwich. His eyes meeting hers. You're the only person who ever looked at me like I mattered. Charles came over later with enrollment forms. He pulled up a chair beside Jack. His voice low and kind. No uniforms here. No tests that measure your worth. Just effort. Kindness. And a little curiosity. Sound fair? Jack nodded slowly. We'll talk to your guardian later. Charles added. But for now. You're welcome here. Jack blinked up at him. Are you the principal? I suppose I am. Charles said with a small smile. Do you like books? I love them. Jack looked at Sarah. Then back at Charles. Then I think I'm going to like it here. Over the next few weeks. Jack became a quiet fixture in Sarah's classroom. He never fought for attention. He didn't need to. She had always known how to see him. He arrived early each day. Sometimes with a half-eaten granola bar. Sometimes with nothing but his notebook. Sarah made sure there was always a muffin on her desk and a folded blanket in the reading corner. He never asked for either. But they disappeared just the same. Charles often watched from afar. During lunch. During free periods. He saw how Sarah never forced Jack to speak but gently nudged him toward connection. She encouraged him to draw. To write stories. To build bridges out of wooden blocks. One afternoon. Jack wrote a short story about a paper boat that survived a storm because someone had whispered courage into its sails. At the end of the day. Sarah handed the story to Charles. He is healing. She said. Her voice thick with emotion. Charles nodded. His eyes soft. So are you. The three of them formed an unspoken rhythm. Sarah with her quiet presence. Jack with his fragile trust. Charles with his steady support. They read together. Sometimes all three of them sitting on the classroom rug. Passing pages like prayers. They ate sandwiches and shared silent laughter over comic strips. They never called it therapy. But it was. It was healing through proximity. Through stillness. Through being seen and not questioned. One afternoon. Jack handed Sarah a folded piece of paper. Inside was a sketch. It showed a woman with blonde hair holding the hand of a boy beside a small school with big windows. Standing just behind them was a man with kind eyes. Holding an umbrella above them both. Sarah looked up at Jack. He only smiled faintly. Charles. Passing by. Paused at the doorway. Good drawing. Jack. Jack shrugged. I just drew what I see. Charles looked at Sarah and smiled. And for the first time. She saw that he didn't just see a drawing. He saw it. Too. The morning sun filtered through the wide classroom windows. Casting golden light across the rug where Sarah and Charles sat among a circle of second graders. Today's lesson was part of their weekly life skills class. Something New Hope Academy cherished as much as math or reading. This morning's theme was kindness and family, two concepts the school believed could never be taught too early. Sarah held up a handmade poster covered in colorful handprints. What do you think makes a family? She asked. Her blonde hair catching the light like a halo. Love. Said one little girl with pigtails. Hugs. Added a boy. lifting both arms for emphasis. Someone who shares their cookies. Another chimed in. And the room erupted with giggles. Charles, sitting cross-legged next to Sarah, smiled warmly. Those are all perfect answers. Families come in many forms. Some are big. Some are small. Some with grandparents. Some with moms and dads. Some with friends who become family. As Sarah leaned forward to hand out little paper hearts for the kids to write on. One small boy, James, a curious child with a constant smudge on his nose, suddenly tilted his head and asked, "Miss Ellis, are you and Mr. Charles married?" The room went silent for a heartbeat. Then exploded into a fresh round of giggles and squeals. Charles coughed softly, his ears visibly turning red. Sarah's cheeks flushed. But she smiled gently and composed herself. "No, sweetheart," she said, kneeling so she could look James in the eye. "We are not married." James blinked. "But you laugh together like my mom and dad." Sarah chuckled, the warmth in her voice like sunlight. "That is because Mr. Charles is a very special person. You see, sometimes love doesn't have to mean getting married. Love can mean listening, helping, and caring. It can mean making sure someone is never left behind." She looked around at the sea of wide-eyed children and added, "Mr. Charles and I, we care deeply about everyone here. We are not husband and wife. But we are part of this big, messy, beautiful family called New Hope. And we both love this family very much." Charles watched her with something unreadable in his eyes. Admiration. Certainly. And respect. But something softer. Too. Something that made his chest ache a little in the best way. The students returned to their activity, writing what family meant to them on the paper hearts and taping them to the wall. As they worked, Sarah stood to help one child spell forgiveness. And Charles quietly stepped out to handle a phone call. When the lesson ended and the children filed out for recess, the room slowly settled into its usual quiet hum. Sarah moved to her desk, organizing the hearts they had collected, smiling at the ones scrawled with phrases like snacks, holding hands, and someone who comes back. That was when she noticed the note. It was a small slip of paper tucked under her notebook, folded once, neat and square. It carried the faint scent of his cologne, just enough to make her breath pause. She opened it slowly. It read, "I am not your husband. But if ever I am lucky enough to be your companion in the long run, it would be the honor of my life." Her fingers trembled just slightly. She glanced toward the door. But Charles had not returned. For a moment, she sat quietly at her desk, the paper held to her chest. It was not a grand declaration. It was not loud or showy. But it was everything Sarah had learned to value: gentle, honest, and brave without needing to be bold. That afternoon, when Charles reappeared with a stack of files in hand, he passed by her desk without a word. But their eyes met for a brief, charged second. She smiled. He smiled back. Nothing else was said. But the air between them carried something new. Something tender and full of promise. And in the silence, Sarah felt the same thing she had once felt when she opened her desk drawer and found a bruised apple from a child who had nothing else to give. She felt seen, chosen, cared for. Maybe it was not love the way fairy tales told it. But it was the kind that grew slowly, gently, like strong roots under the floor of a classroom where hope lived and breathed in quiet corners. The email arrived on a Monday morning. Written in stiff, formal language and wrapped in polite venom. It came from the office of Victoria Langford, a prominent donor and the parent of a 6th-grade student at New Hope Academy. Her message was short but pointed. She had serious concerns about the perceived personal relationship between Ms. Sarah Ellis and Headmaster Charles Cole. And she believed it undermined the professional integrity of the institution. If the matter was not addressed immediately, she would be withdrawing her financial support. Effective at the end of the quarter. The threat was clear. Over $30,000 in scholarships, field trips, and student meals were tied to her name. Sarah sat at her desk. The letter printed and folded in her lap. Her cheeks were pale. Her breath unsteady. "I don't want this to become a scandal," she said quietly as Charles closed the door behind him. "This school, these kids, they shouldn't suffer because of whispers." Charles, standing across from her, crossed his arms. "You have done nothing wrong. It doesn't matter," Sarah said, her voice tight with anxiety. "It's about what it looks like. What people choose to believe. She is choosing to see what fits her narrative." Charles replied, his jaw set. "That is not your responsibility." Sarah looked away, staring out the window where a few students ran laughing through the garden. "Maybe I should step down from the mentorship program. Just for now. Let things cool down." "No," he said, firmer than she had ever heard him. "You are not hiding. Not for this. But the donation. Charles. I would rather lose money than ask you to disappear." The tension grew as the week went on. Whispers echoed in the hallway. A few parents canceled appointments. One local blog post speculated about favoritism and blurred lines between professionalism and emotion. Then came the school board meeting. It was held in the multi-purpose room under the soft glow of mismatched ceiling lights. Folding chairs were lined up in careful rows. Parents, staff, and community members gathered. Many watching Charles and Sarah with unreadable expressions. Victoria Langford sat near the front, her polished nails gleaming as she flipped through a stack of printed notes. When Charles took the stage, he looked briefly at Sarah, who stood near the door, her heart thudding in her chest. He cleared his throat and began. "There have been concerns raised about impropriety within our staff. Specifically, that a relationship perceived or real between two adults could tarnish this school's image." A murmur passed through the crowd. "I will say this plainly," Charles continued, his voice ringing with conviction. "Ms. Sarah Ellis is one of the most principled, compassionate, and professional educators I have ever worked with. Her presence at New Hope has changed lives, including mine." Victoria's eyebrow arched in disdain. "I understand the power of appearances," Charles said, his gaze sweeping the room. "And I understand the importance of financial support. But I will not sacrifice integrity for comfort. I will not ask a good woman to step back because someone else feels uncomfortable with kindness." He let the silence stretch, heavy and meaningful. This school was founded on the belief that people are more important than optics. That we stand up for one another. That we do not trade sincerity for donations. He turned toward Victoria directly. And if you feel this vision no longer aligns with your expectations, we thank you for your past support. And we wish you well. Gasps echoed around the room. Victoria rose. Her lips pressed into a thin, tight line, and walked out without another word. There was a long, stunned pause. Then, someone clapped. One solitary clap. Then another. And another. Until a slow, rising wave of applause filled the room. After the meeting, Charles found Sarah outside, standing under a maple tree in the cool twilight. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "I did," he said, moving to stand beside her. "And I would again." The next week, small envelopes began arriving at the school. Anonymous checks. Handwritten notes from local shopkeepers. A former student's mother sent a letter with a $20 bill for the woman who taught my son that being poor was not shameful. The donation deficit closed faster than anyone expected. And in the end, New Hope was richer not in money, but in loyalty, in truth, and in the kind of courage that could not be bought. Jack had grown taller. His shoulders had filled out. And he walked with a quiet confidence now. The boy who once whispered instead of spoke. Who flinched at loud noises and sat at the edges of the room. Now stood at the center of classroom discussions. His notebooks were filled with essays, sketches, and reflections. He still preferred to listen more than he talked. But when he did speak, people leaned in to hear. He was 17 now. A senior at New Hope Academy. And one of its most beloved students. When the state's Department of Education announced an open call for student speakers at the Regional Education Conference, Charles nominated Jack without hesitation. At first, Jack shook his head. "I'm not someone people want to listen to." But Sarah had smiled gently and said, "You have something to say that only you can say. That's enough." The conference was held in a vast hotel ballroom an hour outside the city. Dozens of schools were present. When Jack stepped up to the podium, wearing a borrowed blazer and his usual beat-up sneakers, the room quieted. He took a slow breath, glanced toward the crowd where Sarah and Charles sat side by side, and began. "I was not supposed to be here," he said simply. "Not just at this conference, but at any school where I felt safe, or wanted, or seen." He paused, letting the silence settle around him. "When I was 10, I thought being invisible was safer than being noticed. I thought kindness was a trick. That hope was something only other kids were allowed to have. Then, one teacher gave me a sandwich and never asked for anything in return." He smiled faintly. "She let me stay after class when I was too scared to go home. She never told me I was broken. She just waited for me to speak. And when I finally did, she listened." Another pause. "She and the man who runs my school. They built something rare. A place where no one has to earn their worth. Where love is not conditional. Where silence is not mistaken for apathy." He looked directly at Sarah. "She didn't just pull me out of poverty. She taught me that I deserved love. That I had value even when I had nothing to give." There was a profound stillness in the room as he stepped away from the microphone. Then, applause rose slowly. First polite, then building into something thunderous and heartfelt. A few years passed. Seasons turning one into the next. The halls of New Hope Academy looked as they always had, sunlight streaming through tall windows. Artwork taped lovingly to the walls. The faint scent of pencil shavings and old books. But today, something felt different. A new chapter was beginning. Jack stood in front of room 2B. His hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the door. Inside, the room was still and sunlit. Waiting. He walked to the desk, his desk now, and opened the top drawer. Carefully, he placed a single, polished red apple inside. The skin was smooth. The stem curved neatly. It was not for a student who was hungry. It was a tribute. A promise. It was for her. For the woman who had once placed apples in her own drawer for children who had nothing. For the one who had seen him when he was invisible. Outside, Charles stood in the doorway. Arms crossed. Watching the boy he once read about in a newspaper. Jack was a man now. He was taller. More sure-footed. But his eyes still carried that deep, quiet strength. First day. Mr. Evans, Charles said warmly. Jack turned and nodded. A nervous smile on his face. Feels like I've been walking toward this door since I was 10. Charles stepped inside. Nervous? Jack exhaled slowly. Terrified. Good. Charles replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. That's how you know you're ready. Down the hallway, Sarah was greeting students as they arrived. Her hair was shorter now, with soft silver strands framing her face. Her wedding ring caught the morning light as she handed out folders and warm smiles. When she saw Jack standing in his own classroom doorway, a teacher ready to welcome his first students, she paused and pressed a hand gently over her heart. He met her gaze across the hall and gave a small, confident nod. She smiled back, her eyes shining with a pride that was almost overwhelming. That evening, the school hosted a small ceremony to welcome its new teachers. Families filled the auditorium, which was strung with lights and filled with laughter. Charles spoke first, briefly, then invited Jack to the stage. Jack stood at the podium, nervous but steady. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Charles at the side of the stage and Sarah seated in the front row. I never thought I'd be standing here, Jack began. For a long time, I didn't think I'd be standing anywhere at all. He paused, the room quietening. When I was a boy, I was lost, hungry, and forgotten. But a teacher didn't turn away. She saw me. She fed me. She listened to me. And she stayed when no one else did. He turned his gaze toward Sarah. She didn't just teach me to read. She taught me that I mattered. Then Jack looked to Charles. And another person stood by her when the world tried to push her down. He showed me that real leaders protect not just rules, but people. Especially the people who love. Jack's voice grew stronger, filled with a conviction that came from a healed heart. I'm here because a teacher didn't abandon me. And because a headmaster didn't abandon her. Later, as the crowd thinned and twilight filled the windows with liquid gold, Charles found Sarah near the back of the empty room. They stood in the warm, peaceful hush of the moment, their shoulders touching. You taught him so much, Charles said softly. Sarah smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. You taught me that a school could be a home. You gave us all a place to heal. But you, he whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. You taught me everything about the heart. They looked across the room at Jack, who was laughing with a group of students and their parents. The apple still sat in his drawer. A quiet, glowing symbol of where he had been and where he was going. And in that soft light, New Hope felt more than just a school. It felt like a promise fulfilled. A circle completed. A testament to the enduring truth that the very best things in life are given, not earned. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of love, resilience, and the quiet power of compassion. Jack's story reminds us that one single act of kindness can echo through a lifetime, changing the world one heart at a time. And sometimes, the most life-changing lessons are taught not with chalk and textbooks, but with courage and an open heart. If this story touched your soul, imagine how many others are waiting to do the same. Subscribe to soul-stirring stories and become part of a community that believes in the beauty of real-life miracles, gentle heroes, and unforgettable moments that prove the goodness in humanity. Turn on your notifications. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And help us continue spreading stories that heal, inspire, and move hearts. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay kind, stay hopeful, and never underestimate the power of a single apple in the right hands.